One of the most disturbing cases of family isolation and inbreeding ever documented in the United States had its revelation witnessed by Osley County, Kentucky, on September 27, 1981. Located in the heart of the Appalachians, Osley was already known as one of America's poorest counties, where for generations, families lived in isolated valleys, separated from the rest of the world by impossible mountains and roads that became inaccessible during harsh winters. Under a fine drizzle that shrouded the mountains in mist on that specific day, a state social services team was conducting routine visits to unregistered properties when they came across a deteriorated house in the region known as La Rose. Accessible only by a dirt path that wound between pine trees and century-old oaks, the property was almost 5 miles from the main road. The silent history of that valley would be forever changed by what they found. Darkened by time, the house was a wooden structure with no windows, only openings covered with pieces of plastic and cardboard. Obvious holes were in the roof, and the surrounding land was overtaken by tall weeds and rust. The unusual silence was the first thing that caught the social worker's attention. Even in the most isolated properties, there were always sounds, chickens, an old radio, conversations. There, the silence seemed like an entity of its own. When they knocked on the door, an elderly-looking woman, later identified as 72-year-old Martha Brham, greeted them. She tried to prevent the assistants from entering, but the visibly debilitated appearance of the elderly woman and the strong odor emanating from inside justified immediate intervention. Inside that house without electricity or running water lived 6 people, of Martha, her 49-year-old daughter, Louise Brham, and 4 younger women, later identified as Louise's daughters. Alarming physical characteristics were presented by the 4 women, approximately between 18 and 30 years old. They had asymmetrical faces, severe strabismus, prominent jaws, and most notably, an evident difficulty in communication. None of them spoke clearly, only emitting guttural sounds and rudimentary phrases that only they seemed to understand. Even the most experienced social workers were impressed by the scene. In their official reports, they described the women moving through the space like ghosts, apparently without fully recognizing our presence. Uncoordinated were their movements, and all exhibited repetitive mannerisms, such as rocking back and forth continuously. The total absence of records was the most disturbing part. None of the 4 women had a birth certificate, school record, or any official document. It was as if they didn't exist to the world beyond those walls. Just the beginning of the discovery of a history of inbreeding that extended for decades would be that case, an invisible cycle of isolation, abuse, and neglect that produced one of the clearest examples of the devastating effects of continued family crossbreeding. As the authorities tried to understand what they were seeing, the 4 sisters, Agnes, Mary, Louise, and Catherine, names they would receive later, as they had no official identities, remained seated on the dirt floor, as if that interruption in routine was just a brief inconvenience in decades of silence. The true story of those women, however, had begun much earlier in another era of Kentucky, when geographical and cultural isolation formed the perfect setting for a family to close in on itself for generations. If you want to follow more cases like this, which shake entire societies and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. An unprecedented challenge was faced by county authorities after the initial discovery: how to investigate a situation where there were practically no records, external witnesses, or any formal documentation. The 4 women were immediately taken to Cumberland Valley Regional Hospital for medical evaluation, while Louise and Martha remained in custody. An alarming picture was revealed by the first medical reports dated September 30, 1981. A series of physical and cognitive characteristics compatible with what doctors at the time called degeneration by inbreeding were presented by the 4 sisters. In his confidential report, Dr. Robert Harkins, head of the medical team, noted, "We are facing a case where family endogamy seems to have occurred for multiple generations, resulting in classic manifestations of accumulated recessive disorders." From the beginning, the investigation into the family history faced significant obstacles. Martha Brham refused to cooperate, claiming that family matters are nobody's business. Contradictory and vague was the little information she provided. Louise, in turn, presented limited cognitive capacity and showed evident signs of deep psychological trauma. It was through parish records from the local Baptist church and testimonies from distant neighbors that investigators began to piece together the macabre puzzle of the Brham lineage. A history dating back to the 1920s was pointed to by the first clues, when William Brham, Louise's father, established himself in that isolated region after leaving a mining community in Harlan County. From Joseph Miller, then 83 years old, who had lived about 2 miles from the Brham property since 1925, came one of the most important testimonies. According to his account to social worker Margaret Thompson on October 5, 1981, William was a strange man who didn't allow anyone near his property. He married a second cousin, Sally, who already had trouble speaking properly. After she died in childbirth of one of the children around 1940, we never saw an adult woman in that house again, just little Eloise growing up. The other children, 2 boys, also never left there. The testimony of Florence Watson, a midwife who had worked in the region since the 1930s, was another crucial point in the investigation. In her statement on October 12, 1981, she revealed, "I was called to the Brham property in 1945 to help with the birth of a young woman. When I arrived, I saw that it was Eloise, only 13 years old, pregnant and in labor. William didn't let me stay after the baby was born, a boy. I tried to alert the sheriff at the time, but nobody wanted to get involved with the Brhams." On reconstructing the chronology of births on the property, the investigation began to focus. Between 1945 and 1963, Eloise apparently gave birth to 6 children, including the 4 women found in 1981. There were no formal records of any of these births, and the absence of genetic tests at the time made it impossible to determine with certainty the paternity of each one. However, a disturbing scenario was indicated by the clinical evaluation and collected testimonies. William Brham had not only abused his own daughter, Eloise, but his sons, Eloise's brothers, apparently continued the incestuous cycle after his death in 1967, resulting in the birth of the 4 women. A false lead arose when investigators speculated about the possibility of the women belonging to an isolationist religious community, a theory quickly dismissed after consultations with experts on religious groups in the region. Another line of investigation considered a possible involvement with family clans producing moonshine, illegally distilled liquor common in the region during and after the Prohibition era, but also found no concrete evidence. The sudden death of Martha Brham on October 29, 1981, just 1 month after the discovery of the case, was one of the most significant obstacles to the investigation. Due to complications from pneumonia and malnutrition, the elderly woman died at the county hospital, taking with her many of the answers that investigators were seeking. By November 1981, a predominant theory had been established by the official investigation. William Brham initiated a cycle of incestuous abuse with his daughter Eloise in the 1940s, resulting in the birth of children who, in turn, continued the consanguineous cycle with their own mother and among themselves. The product of this complex genetic intertwining were the 4 women found in 1981, being simultaneously daughters, sisters, and cousins in a family tree that folded in on itself. An unprecedented dilemma was faced by the Osley County Prosecutor's Office. How to proceed legally in a case where the main witnesses and potential defendants had severe cognitive limitations or had already died. Additionally, considering that the initial abuses dated back to the 1940s, the statute of limitations for many of the crimes had expired. In an internal memo dated December 14, 1981, District Attorney Clarence Hammond wrote, "This case represents not only an unprecedented legal challenge but also a systemic failure of our social and community institutions. While we seek to hold accountable the potential perpetrators still alive, we must recognize that society as a whole has failed these women for decades." As the investigation advanced into 1982, significant discoveries began to emerge from the silent past of the Brham family. In January of that year, researchers from the University of Kentucky were called to evaluate the case from a broader medical and anthropological perspective. The team, led by Dr. Helen Montgomery, a specialist in population genetics, analyzed medical records and conducted extensive interviews with longtime residents of the region. One of the most revealing documents was found in the archives of the local church, a baptismal record book containing notes from Pastor Jonathan Williams dated 1935, where he expressed concern about the improper marriage between William Brham and his cousin Sally. The pastor wrote, "I visited the Brham family today and found a concerning situation. William and Sally share maternal grandparents, and signs that our ancestors would associate with too much mixed blood are already noticeable in the children. In March 1982, a diary belonging to midwife Florence Watson, who had died in 1979, was located by the investigation. Detailed accounts of the births she attended at the Brham property between 1945 and 1963 were found in the yellowed pages. In a particularly disturbing entry from August 1951, she wrote, "I was called again to the Brham house. Little Eloise, now 19 years old, gave birth to her third child. The child presents the same distant eyes as the others. No man besides William and his sons lives on that property. May God have mercy on those children." 6 births from Eloise were revealed by Florence's diary, in 1945, 1947, 1951, 1954, 1958, and 1963. The 4 women found in 1981 corresponded to the births of 1951, Agnes, 1954, Mary, 1958, Louise, and 1963, Catherine. There was no mention of the first 2 children in more recent records. A particularly impactful revelation came when the medical team performed cranial radiographs and detailed physical examinations of the 4 sisters. Dr. Samuel Pierce, a specialist in genetic disorders from the University Hospital, observed, "The patterns of bone, facial, and neurological anomalies present in the 4 women are consistent with the accumulation of deleterious recessive genes through multiple generations of inbreeding. Particularly notable are the symmetrical craniofacial malformations present in all of them, suggesting a very close common ancestor." In April 1982, an accidental discovery brought new light to the case. During repair works on a secondary road near the Brham property, workers found bone remains buried in a swampy terrain. The forensic analysis completed in June 1982 identified the remains as belonging to 2 children of approximately 2 and 5 years old who had been buried at least 30 years ago. Although it was impossible to determine with certainty the identity of the children without genetic tests, which would only become available years later, the location and time corresponded to Eloise's first 2 children, who were never located. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation came through a late testimony from Harriet Comalms, a social worker who had briefly visited the property in 1967 after receiving an anonymous complaint. In her statement in July 1982, she reported, "I arrived at the property and was greeted by Martha, who prevented me from entering. I could briefly see the interior through the half-open door. I saw several people sitting on the floor, including young women and at least 2 adult men. What impressed me was that they all rocked back and forth at the same rhythm, as if they were in a trance. Martha said they were just praying their way and that I should respect their religious beliefs." Comalms admitted that she did not insist on the inspection and did not formally record the incident due to pressure from the local community to not interfere in her mountain matters. Her late testimony illustrated how cultural isolation and institutional neglect had allowed the cycle of abuse to persist for decades. In August 1982, investigators located a former postal worker who made deliveries in the region between 1960 and 1975. He reported that William Brham regularly received correspondence from a state institution in Frankfurt, likely related to social or agricultural benefits. This indicated that despite their isolation, the family maintained some minimal contact with government institutions, which, however, never conducted follow-up visits. A crucial piece of evidence emerged in September 1982 when Dr. Montgomery's team analyzed old photographs of the community and identified Eloise in a school photo from 1940, her only appearance in official records. The 8-year-old girl already showed subtle physical signs compatible with first-degree consanguinity, suggesting that the incestuous cycle could have begun even before her, possibly with her own parents. Throughout these months of investigation, the 4 sisters remained in a state institution for people with cognitive disabilities, where they received proper medical care and basic education for the first time. Modest but significant progress was indicated by the institution's reports. After 6 months, Agnes and Mary could already communicate with simple phrases and learned basic self-care tasks. Louise and Catherine, the youngest, demonstrated greater adaptability and learning capacity. Leave in the comments, never give up on the truth if you believe all missing persons deserve to be found. By the end of 1982, after more than a year of intensive investigation, what became known as the Brham case had finally been established by Kentucky authorities, one of the most extreme examples of family isolation and continuous inbreeding documented in the United States. More complex and disturbing than the initial assumptions was the story that emerged. William Brham, born in 1902, grew up in an isolated mining community in the Appalachians, where marriages between cousins were relatively common due to geographical and cultural isolation. In 1920, he married his second cousin, Sally Jenkins, with whom he had 3 children: Louise, born in 1932, and 2 boys, Jacob, 1934, and Caleb, 1936. After Sally's death during the birth of a 4th, stillborn child in 1938, William isolated the family even more, moving to a remote property in Osley County. It was there, as investigators determined, that he initiated a cycle of incestuous abuse with his daughter Louise, resulting in the birth of her first child in 1945 when she was only 13 years old. From there, the horror multiplied. Both William and his sons, Jacob and Caleb, maintained incestuous relationships with Louise, creating a complex genetic web where the subsequent children born were simultaneously siblings, half-siblings, and cousins. Martha, William's mother-in-law, and Sally's mother, remained on the property throughout this period, apparently accepting or unable to prevent what was happening. The following timeline and genealogy were established by the final legal documents compiled in December 1982. 1945, birth of Louise's first child, paternity attributed to William, her own father. This child, a boy, died at age 2 and was buried on the property. 1947, birth of the second child, uncertain paternity between William and Jacob, Louise's father or brother. This child also died in early childhood. 1951, birth of Agnes, paternity attributed to Caleb, Louise's brother. 1954, birth of Mary, paternity attributed to Jacob, Louise's brother. 1958, birth of Louise, paternity possibly attributed to the son born in 1945, Louise's son and brother, before his death. 1963, birth of Catherine, paternity attributed to William, shortly before his death. The genetic implications were profound. In his final report, Dr. Samuel Pierce explained, this case represents an extreme example of multigenerational consanguinity where the coefficient of inbreeding reached levels rarely documented in modern medical literature. The phenotypic manifestations observed in the 4 surviving women are consistent with the homozygotic expression of multiple deleterious recessive genes. A constellation of rare genetic conditions was presented by the 4 sisters in medical terms, including moderate microcephaly, characteristic craniofacial deformities, moderate to severe intellectual disability, skeletal anomalies, particularly in the extremities, congenital heart problems in 3 of them, partial hearing loss, neurological disorders manifested as repetitive movements and communication difficulties. The legal resolution of the case was complicated by several factors. William Brham had died in 1967. Jacob and Caleb, who would have been between 46 and 48 years old in 1982, were never located. Investigators suspected they had also died or left the region years before. Louise, at 50 years old in 1982, was assessed as severely cognitively compromised and unable to legally answer for her actions. On February 14, 1983, Judge Howard Thornton issued his final decision. Louise Brham was declared legally incapable and sent to a state institution for long-term care. There were no formal criminal charges due to the death of the main perpetrators and Louise's mental state. Wards of the state of Kentucky became the 4 sisters, Agnes, Mary, Louise, and Catherine, remaining in specialized institutions. The impact of the case on the local community and state institutions was profound. In March 1983, a new protocol for regular visits to isolated properties, especially in mountainous regions with a history of cultural isolation, was instituted by the Kentucky Department of Social Services. State legislation was revised to strengthen child protection mechanisms and abuse prevention. For the small community of Osley County, the case represented a turning point. The silence that had allowed horror to perpetuate for decades was finally broken. In an editorial in the local Osley County News in April 1983, the editor wrote, "For too long, we have hidden our eyes behind the notion of family privacy and mountain autonomy. The Brham case teaches us a painful lesson about the price of silence and collective indifference." More about the lasting impact of extreme inbreeding was revealed by the subsequent developments of the case. Throughout the 1980s, the four sisters received medical treatments and special education they had never had access to before. Slow but significant progress was documented by the institution's reports. Agnes, the oldest, never developed complete speech but learned basic sign communication and could perform simple tasks with supervision. She died in 1997 due to cardiac complications at the age of 46. Mary demonstrated greater adaptability, learning to read simple words and developing notable artistic abilities. Her drawings, often depicting four female figures holding hands, were preserved by the institution. She died in 2001 at age 47 due to a respiratory infection. Louise, considered the most resilient of the four, eventually managed to work on supervised tasks in the institution's laundry and develop basic social relationships with staff and other residents. She died in 2008 at the age of 50. Catherine, the youngest, presented the most significant cognitive gains after receiving adequate stimulation. In 1990, she was transferred to a residential group environment with supervision, where she lived until her death in 2012 at the age of 49. The old Brham property, the scene of decades of horror, was eventually taken by the state for lack of tax payment. In 1990, the deteriorated structure was demolished, and the area gradually returned to nature. Today, few local residents can identify the exact location where the house stood. In 2002, a discreet memorial was established in the county cemetery dedicated to the Brham sisters and all silent victims of isolation and neglect. The plaque contains only 4 names: Agnes, Mary, Louise, and Catherine, without dates or additional details, a silent testimony to lives that almost went unnoticed by society. As a somber reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation and institutional neglect, the legacy of the Brham case persists. The story of the 4 sisters from Kentucky has become a case study in social service and medical colleges, illustrating the devastating effects of continued inbreeding and the critical importance of social protection systems. In a retrospective report published in 2010 by the Kentucky Department of Health and Human Services, the commissioner wrote, "The Brham case represents a systemic failure that transcends specific individuals or departments. It was a failure of an entire society to recognize and protect its most vulnerable members. The lessons learned continue to shape our policies and practices to this day." Beyond the medical and legal aspects, profound questions about community, collective responsibility, and the complicit silence that sometimes allows horror to flourish in the shadows are raised by the case. As Dr. Helen Montgomery observed in her final report on the case, the tragedy of the Brham sisters was not just the result of horrible acts committed by individuals, but also of countless acts of omission by neighbors, officials, and institutions that preferred not to see what was before their eyes. Today, the case remains one of the most extreme examples of inbreeding documented in American medical history, not only for the degree of genetic proximity involved but for the duration of the incestuous cycle over multiple generations. Rare insights into the cumulative effects of severe endogamy in humans were offered to researchers by the physical and cognitive characteristics of the 4 sisters. The most inbred women of Kentucky, as they became known, never knew about the impact their existences would have on medicine, child protection legislation, and public awareness. They lived and died in a limited world, first by the walls of a windowless house, then by the gentler walls of the institutions that finally offered them care. If you watch this far, it's because you care about these cases that mark families forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far so I can get to know you and know who really cares about the search for truth." Don't forget to like this video and share it with those who are also interested in real cases that make us reflect on the limits of the human condition.